Hey y'all, this is Culture Soup, where tech, culture, and business collide. It's a podcast that spoons up everything hot from social media. I'm your host, L. Michelle Smith, and each episode we bring you some of the most notable and not yet notable thought leaders in tech, business, and culture. The year was 2023, and it was the year that I would release Yes Please, 7 Ways to Say I'm Entitled to the C-Suite. It would be my first time ever attempting a book tour. I started here in Dallas, and it's pretty easy to get people to help out with interviewing, whether it's media personalities, or in this case, had my PR person stand in for the media personality that was going to be there. But we had a great time. My next stop was going to be Atlanta. Atlanta was a great place to go. And 44th and 3rd bookstore in Atlanta greeted me and welcomed me and my team, as well as my guests for the book signing there. My third stop was Washington, D.C. And I had some folks recommend people in the media, journalists who could interview me while I was there. And I did get a response from 2 or 3 of them. But then it hit me. There's somebody in DC that made a whole lot of sense when it came to my journey, and actually someone who knew me and the stories of my businesses. You see, she was my first client. As you recall, my second client was Valerie Burton, who wound up being my mentor coach. I have my credentials because of Valerie. The first client, also a journalist, but not in front of the camera. She was a producer at ABC News for the legendary Carol Simpson. She was also a talent executive, meaning she developed talent to go on the air, one of which was a name you probably remember, Peter Jennings. That's not why I knew Alelia. I knew Alelia because she's a member of the National Association of Black Journalists, just as I was. And Carol Simpson was the one that introduced me to Alelia by email, because she told me she knew that she had a book that she needed to publicize. And at the time, I had just launched my PR agency. So we met in Milwaukee back in 1990 something. It was the late 90s. And she told me about her book, On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker. Talking about Alelia Bundles, she was the journalist that I chose to interview me at Busboys and Poets in Washington, D.C. She's my guest again today because guess what? She has another book. And this one is also about her ancestors and someone that you got to know a little bit, but probably in the wrong light, on the Netflix series Self-Made with Octavia Spencer. Without further ado, I want to reintroduce to you someone who's been on the show a couple of times before, but it's Women's History Month, and she's back. Everyone, my friend, Alelia Bundles. Let's get it. All right, everybody, it's been a little while, but we are back. It's Women's History Month, and I am so excited to have a guest that's been with us a couple of times, Alelia Bundles. She is my friend. You also probably know her as the great-granddaughter of Madam C.J. Walker, and you've seen Self-Made on Netflix, and you've probably seen the line of products that were resurrected in Sephora, but now she has something else, and she teased it the last time she was here. She is writing about Madam Walker's daughter. So that makes Madam Walker's daughter Alelia's great-great-grand. Is that right?
It's two greats.
Great-great-grandmother. Okay. Her name is Alelia Walker. She went by Lilia, but her name is Alelia, just like Alelia. Isn't that something? And she is what Alelia is calling Joy Goddess, which is the name of the book that's coming out on the 10th. And she is a central figure in the Harlem Renaissance. And you know what? I can't wait for this book, Alelia. I'm so excited.
Well, Michelle, this has been a long time coming. I am really excited to be publishing this book about Alelia Walker, my great grandmother, and my namesake. So I'm actually the third Alelia. Madam Walker named her daughter Lelia. She changed it to Alelia, A
Oh,
apostrophe, capital Lelia. My grandmother's name was May. My mother's name was Alelia May,
yes,
and I'm Alelia. But
that's
this
amazing.
is a story that I really first became attracted to, even before I could read, when I began to discover things in my grandmother's dresser drawer that had belonged to Alelia Walker. And
Mhm.
then when I was a senior in high school, I wrote my first report about her because she knew the Harlem Renaissance writers and artists and musicians and actors who I was just starting to learn about.
Oh, wow. So, how much of that research from way back when you were in grade school made it into this book? Did it?
You know, a lot of it, a lot of that research has made it into this book because my grandmother, after Alelia Walker died in 1931, my grandmother moved the contents of her homes, her apartments, and her townhouse to Indianapolis. And
Mm,
so when I was a little girl and I was going through the dresser drawers in my grandmother's room, I found ostrich feather fans and mother of
wow.
pearl opera glasses and little miniature mummy charms that Alelia Walker had bought
Mm.
in Cairo in Egypt in 1922. So those the kinds of things fascinated me. I also had first edition books of like Langston Hughes's The Weary Blues and Jean Toomer's Cane and Count Cullen's Color. So those were things that I had that were in my possession. And then years later, when I was in graduate school at Columbia in journalism, I started writing about Madam Walker, but we had literally thousands of letters between Madam Walker, their attorney, and Alelia Walker. And I've used those letters as the foundation for my research and then expanded it with oral histories, with interviews with some of the Harlem Renaissance people that I interviewed really in the early 1980s.
That's amazing. This journalism that you did for years has come in handy, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. I wanted to be the last thing I thought I would be doing is telling the story of the women in my family. I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to be my own person. But their story is so much more interesting than many of the things that I did when I was a journalist working for NBC News and ABC News. But those skills that I learned, the reporting, the interviewing, the research, all of those things have really come in handy for the books that I've written about Madam Walker and Alelia Walker.
So, is it official? Are you a historian?
Well, I don't have a PhD, so my friends who are in the academy, might not consider me a PhD historian, but I
Sure.
think I have kind of earned my stripes in doing this research.
I would say so too. Hey, Alelia, what do you say we have a culture soup moment? Are you
All
ready?
right.
So, it's Women's History Month. So, we're going to see that hashtag, despite what's going on in the political ether, people are still going to celebrate this month. Tell me what you think is most important for us to know about Lilia Walker as the joy goddess herself, that is most insightful for this time and this season that we're in.
Most people know if they know Lily Walker's name, they think, oh, she's Madam Walker's daughter. And she was an heiress. But I will say she was that and so much more. She really was a patron of the arts. She was a person who was kind of a social impresario, not just a person who gave parties, but her parties were visionary. They were interesting. She brought together all of the writers and artists and musicians of that era, but she also brought together European royals and African diplomats and African American
Mhm.
socialites. And they came together in a way that was interracial and international, that was really kind of unprecedented for the time. What I love about her is that She was a businesswoman, but she also had a great appreciation for culture.
Mm,
Her parties were live music, and they were people who would not otherwise have gotten together but for her. So I really love that. When she was trying to kind of carve out her own identity,
mhm,
everybody had these expectations because Alelia Walker's Madam Walker's daughter, they wanted her to be the same person that her mother was. Well, of course, you can't live up to, such a daunting kind of reputation. She needed to be herself. And the way that
mhm,
she carved out her own identity was to promote the careers and to talk about, gather together the musicians and the writers and the artists who were her friends. She and her mother shared a love of culture.
mhm.
And I think it's you might think, how is it that she understood culture? But even when they were poor, very poor in St. Louis, Madam Walker, who was then known as Sarah Breedlove, had a good enough voice to be in the choir at St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church.
Yes, thanks to you, I know she's AME because that
That's
comes up in my book, Call and Response. But we'll get there at some point.
Well,
Yeah, she
I
was a
what I lo yeah, well, I mean, what I love about this AME connection is that it was the women of St. Paul AME Church who
choir.
began to give Sarah Breedlove a vision of herself as something other than an illiterate washerwoman. So
Mhm.
little Lelia, her daughter, is watching her in the choir, watching her interact with these other women and gaining an appreciation for music. It's
Yes.
also a moment in St. Louis when they're still very poor, but they live across the alley from Tom Turpin's Rosebud Cafe, where Scott Joplin played. So the
Wow.
kids are learning church music, they're seeing ragtime. In the schools, the Black principals, many of them had gone to Oberlin, but the music department was run by German immigrants. So
Mm.
the kids were also learning German lieder. They
Wow.
were hearing opera. So all of that sort of combines together to be a bonding for Madam Walker and Alelia Walker. They loved culture, they loved music, they loved theater. And when they had money, that was one of the things that they did together was to promote young musicians.
That's amazing. So, Lil, you can sing and Madam Walker?
Well, and it interesting. I'm glad you asked that because I interviewed Alberta Hunter, the very
Mhm.
famous blues singer, in the 1980s. And in my interview with her, she said that Alelia Walker had a great singing voice. Now, I don't have any recordings of her, but I think coming from Alberta Hunter, that's a really important endorsement.
Sure.
But of course, she knew that her friends who truly were talented, she wasn't trying to perform in the way that they were, but apparently she could hold her own.
I love this. I love this. There's so much to learn, not just about Lilia, because we're going to get to know her. And I want to hold up the book so everybody can see. Y'all, it's beautiful. You see
Yeah, I
that?
love
Joy
this. I
Goddess.
love this cover.
It's gorgeous. And she's gorgeous. Look at that. Yeah.
And the photo was taken by Addison Scurlock,
Oh.
who did the most famous photograph of Madam Walker that appeared on the stamp was also taken by
Oh.
Addison Scurlock.
Wow. So much history here. Now, you know what? There's so much that we're going to learn that we didn't learn already, that we didn't know already about Lilia and also about Madam Walker in the context of Lilia. Tell me more, because you started to kind of walk up to this point, and that is that people tend to think that Lilia was this party girl. That's all she did, but she had a business side too.
Mhm.
Talk to me about that. Kind of debunk some myths about Lilia.
Yeah, a part of writing about Madam Walker and Amelia Walker is debunking myths.
Mhm.
They sort of people kind of caricature them and kind of squash them into, just a cliche. And Alelia Walker, yes, Alelia Walker did have great parties. She absolutely had some of the most fabulous parties of the 1920s, but she was very much a businesswoman. Her mother had created a company, so she didn't create a company, but she had really strong and somewhat visionary ideas about how to promote the company. It
Mm,
really was her suggestion that they have a presence in Harlem. She was running the Pittsburgh office. Her mother had moved to Indianapolis, opened a factory, And Alelia's territory as the Pittsburgh office manager was New York.
Mm.
And she persuaded her mother in 1913, as Harlem was becoming the political and cultural capital of Black America, that they needed to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think that one of the reasons that they are more well known than some of their contemporaries and competitors is that they did have a presence in New York. It
Mm.
was the media capital of the world. It meant that when somebody was writing about the Black community, they wrote about the Walker presence. And
Mm-hmm.
she had a great sense of style, of fashion. They hired the best interior decorators. They hired Vertner Tandy, the first licensed Black architect in New York, to design the house. So it was a showplace. And
Mm.
that was Alelia Walker's idea. It was really Alelia Walker sort of guiding the design and approving those
So
designs.
she was kind of the head of marketing, it sounds like, for
She,
the
you know,
Walker
she was an
Empire.
influencer. She absolutely was
Yeah.
an influencer. Which she went on a trip to Paris, London, Nice, Monte Carlo, Rome, Cairo,
Mm.
Addis Ababa, Palestine in
Fabulous.
1921 and 22. And when she came back, she had this bright idea to do a Holy Land tour. So she traveled throughout the United States. She would sort of assemble people for a lecture, and she'd talk about the Holy Land, because she knew in the Black community, church was the
Yes.
social place. And so she wasn't a biblical scholar by any means, but she talked about her visit to the Holy Land. She
Mm-hmm.
talked about going to these monuments, the things Gethsemane and other places where she knew people, this was in the hymns that people sang.
Mm-hmm.
So she used that as a way to draw people in. They came to hear the Holy Land lecture, but she was also selling products and also encouraging her sales agents.
That's amazing. You know what? Again, everybody, it's Joy Goddess, and it comes out on the 10th, but you could pre-order it now, right?
That's absolutely
Right.
right.
You want to
The
get
publishers, as you know, love the pre-order.
yeah, you got to do that. Y'all pre-order because that's really going to help her get to the list, the big
Exactly.
list.
So,
Uh,
Amazon.com, bookshop.org, Tertulia. There are a number of Simon and Schuster's
yes.
website. So
Yes.
please pre-order. We would love that.
Absolutely. So, I'm all about positive emotion, and all of my books, including the one that's upcoming, has a lot of the positive psychology and neuroscience in it. I can't help but ask you why she was called the Joy Goddess. I mean, outside of the obvious reasons, she knew how to throw a party.
She knew how to throw a party. But yeah, Joy Goddess is a name that I have wanted to put on the cover of a book for years, ever since I discovered it. And it was Langston Hughes
Mm,
who called her the Joy Goddess in his memoir, The Big C.
wow.
He wrote about Alelia Walker and her parties.
Wow.
And he's the one who gave her the name, the Joy Goddess of Harlem's 1920s.
Isn't that something to have somebody like Langston Hughes give you a name
Exactly.
to brand you? I'm sure there are a lot of influencers out there right now that would just die if someone like that gave them a name. You know what? I want to go to a couple places in the book. Let's go to chapter 25 and the title, The Capital of the Negro World.
Mm.
And of course, you're talking about Harlem. Why is it important? You said that Lilia wanted them to have a presence there. Why was that so important? And I know they did some moving, right? They first moved to St. Louis. Didn't they go somewhere else before they landed in New
So
York?
they started in Delta, Louisiana and
Hmm.
Vicksburg, Mississippi, right across the river. Then
Yeah.
when Lelia was 3, Madam, then called Sarah, was a young widow. And so they moved to St. Louis where her older brothers were living. Then they went to Denver and then to Pittsburgh. Then Madam moved to Indianapolis and Alelia
So
moved
you
to
moved to
Harlem.
Harlem. Gotcha.
Mhm.
Okay. So tell us why Harlem is so significant, especially for the listeners out there who may not even be from the United States, or even some of my brethren who may not be Black or know Black history like we do. And, just Just tell us about Harlem.
So,
Why
you
is,
know,
why is it so important?
just to put a little, give a little perspective without too much history, but
Mhm.
it's important to know that the Civil War ended in 1865 and
Right.
4 million African Americans, most of whom were still enslaved, were now free.
Mhm.
And people were working on farms in the South. 90% of African Americans lived in the rural South. But people began to be tired of not having enough and they began to migrate north. Sarah's brothers migrated from Mississippi and Louisiana to St. Louis in the 1870s. They were part of an early migration.
That was an early migration.
Early
So
migration.
they were part of the Great Migration too, it sounds like.
Right. Well, later, but at that
Later.
point, this was like after a decade of working as sharecroppers and realizing
Mhm.
that the end of the season you owed more than you could take in, and
Mhm.
they were just sick of it, and so they followed an early migration. But when World War One started, there were restrictions on immigration from Europe, and that meant that people needed folks to work in the factory. So that began what was really kind of a first great migration.
Mhm.
And Black folks began to leave the farms and began to go to big cities.
Right.
And Harlem was special. There were lots of cities that people went to. They went to Chicago, they went to Indianapolis, they went to Dayton, but
Eventually they went to
Harlem
LA.
was and LA.
Mhm.
Harlem was very special, because there was culture there, people who wanted to perform, people who wanted to sing, people who wanted to write, felt this sense in Harlem that was different from other places. And another key part of that is that Harlem had new housing, relatively new
Mhm.
housing. In so many cities where African Americans arrived, the housing was dilapidated. But
Yeah.
Harlem, that part of New York had overbuilt. So
Mhm.
there were new buildings that people were able to move into. So it was almost a magical place for many people. That's not to say that some people weren't poor and weren't struggling, but there was a certain set of educated Black folks
Mhm.
who now found themselves in Harlem, and people could express themselves both culturally and with financial and with business.
So she was smart enough to say, we need a presence here because this is the capital. You call it the Negro capital. Once she was there, how did she work the jelly? How did she flex?
Well, she what in 1914, Amelia Walker arrived in Harlem in 1913. And by then, her mother wanted to have a presence on a larger stage. Madam Walker had become much more involved in politics with the NAACP's anti-lynching movement. She loved culture. She would visit New York, and she decided that she wanted to move her permanent residence to New York. So the book opens with a chapter where Alelia is hosting a dinner party for her mother in 1914, and she invites some of Harlem's most prominent citizens, the publisher of the Black newspaper, James Reese Europe, who's a really well-known musician, and a number of other people to try to welcome her mother to Harlem.
Mhm.
That's when Madam Walker begins to look at real estate for herself.
Mm.
So this is a moment when there is a lot of excitement about what is going on politically. It's right as World War One is starting. And so by 1916, Madam Walker moves to New York, builds her mansion in Irvington, and moves in 1918. But by then, Alelia has really already established them. She's remodeled this amazing townhouse. The beauty salon, as Madam Walker said in a letter, is as lovely as anything on Fifth Avenue. Their parties always have live music. Everybody wants to see this wealthy businesswoman, Madam Walker. So
Yes.
all of those things combined to make being at the Walker home something very special.
Wow. Now, there's another chapter in here that caught my attention, and that's chapter 9. It's entitled Two Loves. You can tell me about that. But first, I know you don't like this, but let's go back to self made
Yeah,
because
listen,
Amelia was
you
in
know what?
there.
I'm always happy to talk about that.
Yes. Let's debunk some of the myths. about Lilia Walker and her storyline there, and how what you're going to learn in this book
Yeah.
that shows otherwise.
Yeah, listen, I always like to say that Octavia Spencer was great in
We love
Self-Made.
her.
Every time she came on camera, I was like, she really
She
got
did a
the
great job.
assignment
Yeah.
as far as I was
Mhm.
concerned. She knew who Madam Walker was. The sets were beautiful, the costumes were beautiful, the hairstyles were wonderful. Lots of people worked really hard. But the script was not what I wanted. I
Mhm.
was hoping
Mhm.
for Hidden Figures, and I feel like they kinda leaned into a cliche of 2 women catfighting, and,
Yes.
they just kinda distorted Madam Walker's the relationship with Annie Malone. Both women were really, great women who did lots of great things, and I just thought it was, sort of unnecessary to do that cliche of 2 women fighting. But the Alelia Walker character was kind of like 180 degrees from the real person. And that I know that people were, script writers, showrunners trying to check off a box. I just thought the real story was so much more interesting. So,
Sure.
first thing, Alelia Walker did not have a girlfriend. And I won't go into the long
Yeah,
story of why they did that.
love is love. We appreciate
Yeah,
that, but
that's right. If it had been true, that would be cool. But that was, for me, the more interesting story is what really happened. She had 2 boyfriends,
yes.
both doctors, both handsome, both very accomplished. One was a bad boy and one was a good guy.
Mm.
And her mother, of course, liked the good guy.
Mhm.
And she was more excited about the bad boy.
Mhm.
And so there is a little conflict between mother and daughter on that front.
Mhm.
And I don't wanna tell people I don't wanna do the spoiler,
Yeah,
but
don't give
you
away too
have to
much.
read the book to find out
Yes,
what happens.
but I want to show because we got pictures.
Mhm.
There are pictures all throughout this book, y'all. It's so amazing. I don't know how you
Michelle,
get your hands on these
I am
things.
so lucky that my grandparents both understood the importance of the story
Mhm.
and saved lots of things. So from that
Yeah.
moment when I was a toddler and first began to
Like
discover
here's one of the
things.
boyfriends. Can you see that?
Right, that's Dr. Wiley Wilson.
Yes, Riley Wilson.
Wiley,
Do we have a picture?
appropriately
Oh, here's the
named.
other guy. Here's the other guy. Is that
And
the other
this is
guy?
right, this is Dr. James Arthur Kennedy, who his friends called Gentleman Jack.
Wow. And you have to hear about the
He
little
was
love
he was a
triangle.
great tennis player, and as one person said, he could write credible love poems.
Ah. But you know what? God bless them. They didn't have the technology that we have today, but because they wrote so many letters, you
Yes.
can write this book.
Mhm.
Like,
The letters are really sort of peppered throughout,
mhm,
almost to the point where, when I wrote this book, I will say it took me a really long time to write the book. And when my first really serious draft, when my editor read it, my 2 editors, Rebecca Jett and Catherine Belden, and they're like, "Well, there's a lot in here. You
mhm.
have everything you need, but you're gonna have to cut a lot of it if you want anybody to read it." And,
That's a
and
good
they were
problem to
right.
have, though.
They were right.
Mhm.
It would have been too there's I went off on a lot of tangents because all of those things were important to me. All those stories were
Of
important.
course, of
But I
course.
but I think it's now at a very manageable, very readable, just the most important parts so that
Yeah,
people don't get bogged down.
yeah. And I mean, it's how many pages? It's
I don't know, 200 and some.
200 and something, and there's a lot of bibliography in the back.
Right.
So,
And this is, and I don't, some people don't really want to see the bibliography, and I don't want them to have to slog through it. But I do really detailed citations because 50 years from now, I want whoever picks up that book, if they want to do their own version, to have my sources, to have the breadcrumbs.
yes, yes, absolutely. What's the one message that you want people to get from this book?
I want people to know that Alelia Walker, who's Madam Walker's daughter, had her own really fabulous life. That there were there were some challenges. It's challenging to be the child of a really famous person, but she was determined to carve out her own path. And in the process, she brought a lot of joy to other people. She celebrated the careers of a lot of talented culture makers.
Mhm.
And I want people to be able to see that.
Oh, that's awesome. Alelia, give us one more time the date that the book drops, where they can pre-order, all the details.
So, Joy Goddess, hold on a second. My printer just
It's
decided
okay.
that it was going to, I don't know, make noise.
It's okay. We can't hear it and we can
Okay.
edit it.
My new book, Joy Goddess, Alelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance, publishes on June 10th. But you can pre-order today
Yes.
on any place where books are sold. Bookshop.org, Amazon.com, Tertulia, Simon and Schuster. So I hope you will pre-order and follow me on social media at Alelia Bundles, because I will be listing my book parties. I plan to be in lots of places. Or I know that first week I'm in New York, Washington, D.C., and Boston.
I have to ask, are you going to do a salon?
Oh, absolutely. You know, we're already figuring that out,
That's
because
awesome.
I want people to be in the spirit of the Harlem Renaissance. This
Yes.
is 2025 is a milestone year for many major Harlem Renaissance
Mhm.
events. There was a big exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum in New York last year on the Harlem Renaissance. The New York Historical Society is doing an exhibit that opens in October. I already have some events where people are trying to recreate Alelia Walker's salon.
Mhm.
New York Historical Society is rebuilding the bookshelf that was part of the Dark Tower, which is where Alelia Walker entertained a lot of people. So we're working on a lot of really special moments where people will get the feeling of the Harlem Renaissance. I want them to be a part of the Joy Goddesses world.
Yes. I see flappers moving around in their beaded gowns at one of your parties.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, and I have a little, because of my hairstyle, I can't wear the sort of tight hats. But
Yeah.
I've been trying to figure out what my little headdress is.
Oh, did they wear fascinators then?
Well, yes, and some of the headpieces were like fascinators.
Yeah, because you could get one that sits right there on top.
Uh-huh.
Oh, that'd be
I
so
am I
cute.
am ready. I went to a really fun dinner at the Claremont Hotel in Berkeley, California. There's a brother who's a chef there, Joseph Pear, and he had a dinner on Valentine's Day that was inspired by Alelia Walker's Dark Tower. So
Wow.
my special piece of clothing is a beaded shawl that belonged to Alelia Walker, and I pull it out
Oh,
from time to time, because there are a few beads that are coming up. I don't want to
sure.
use it too many times, but for that occasion, I had to bring it out.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And before you go, I have to thank you. Thank you so much for digging around to find the story that you've written for the AME Church newsletter that's included in a lot of ways in my new book coming up, Call and Response 10 Leadership Lessons from the Black Church. That's all I'm going to give everybody. But I wanted to thank you because Madam Walker makes an appearance in my book. Thanks to Alelia.
Well, listen, Michelle, I'm so excited that there was a way for Madam Walker to be in your new book. And those women of the AME Church, they were awesome. They
Yes.
really helped push her on her way.
Yes. Yes. And she got her wings just like so many other business leaders have after her. So thank you so much, Alelia. It is wonderful talking to you. You can always come back.
Thank you. It's always good to see you. And boy, am I so inspired every time I read your newsletter and every time I see something on social. Boy, Michelle is blowing it up.
No, it's thanks to support from people like you that I can do what I do. So I really appreciate you, Alelia.
Thank you.
All righty, bye. What an awesome conversation with Alelia Bundles, the biographer of Alelia Walker, better known as Lilia Walker, the Joy Goddess, and of course, her mother, Madam C.J. Walker. I always love talking to her. listen, there's some things coming up that I want to bring to your attention. One is the Power of Women at Work. That is a day-long summit that is virtual, that is hosted by the Executive Leadership Council. I'll be one of the presenters as well as moderator for Track B for people leaders. So you want to be a part of that. It's being held on March 25th, 2025, all day long. You can still register. Go to elcinfo.org. Also, I will be with the DC Public Library, which is the MLK Memorial Library in Central Washington, D.C. This is also virtual, and you'll be able to join in. I will be hosted by WUSA 9's Allison Seymour, who will interview me about how to be happy as a strategy for your career and your life. And that's from my book, Yes Please, 7 Ways to Say I'm Entitled to the C-Suite. That will be held on March 29th, 2025. Find us online at theculturesoup.com, on Instagram and Twitter at The Culture Soup, and on Facebook at The Culture Soup Podcast. Until next time.
The Culture Soup Podcast is a production of No Size Communication, LLC.
The Culture Soup Podcast is a registered trademark of No Silos Communication.